Today we're going to investigate stories and theories on time distortions associated with the UFO phenomenon. Alright, so I've been wanting to do a video on time distortions for a while. As you know, a lot of paranormal entities like little people and Bigfoot are associated with time distortions. There's a lot of stories of the Fae and time moving forward if you spend any amount of time with them. For most people, spotting a UFO would be considered extremely unusual, but for two Ohio women, seeing a UFO was the least surprising part of their experience. In June 2001, two sisters, Angie and Deborah, were returning from a day of shopping in Dayton, Ohio, when a strange light in the sky caught their attention. We were heading home to Kingman, Ohio, on State Road 73, Deborah recalled. It was a beautiful evening around 8:30 p.m. The air was warm and the sky was crystal clear. Angie was driving and I was watching the scenery go by when I noticed a bright light in the western sky. Deborah watched in amazement as the light grew in intensity and flew towards the car at an incredible speed. Deborah asked me what the weird light was, said Angie, but we were close to Cedar Lake and the road was pretty dark, so I wasn't paying a lot of attention to it. But then it flew right in front of us, so I couldn't miss it. The bright light soared past the car and hovered over the nearby treetops, casting an eerie glow over the entire area. Angie pulled the car over onto the side of the road so they can get a better look at the unusual object. Deborah was shocked by how large and close the UFO was to them. The light was so bright and white that you couldn't see any shape behind it, but we could tell it was pretty big, at least as big as a house. The funny thing was that I couldn't hear any sort of engine like you would normally hear with an airplane or a helicopter. It was completely silent. Suddenly, another identical bright light swooped down from the sky and hovered a short distance away. The two sisters decided that the situation was becoming too strange and tried to drive away. That's when I discovered that the car had stopped and I couldn't restart it, Angie said. Nothing worked. The lights, the radio, it was completely dead. The two women also noticed an odd silence had descended over the area, accompanied by a strange feeling of isolation. Angie remembered that it seems as if they were the only people in the world. I don't remember seeing another car come by during the entire time we were there, which is really weird, because at that time of the evening there's always traffic on that road, and it was just dead silent outside. No birds, nothing. It was as if we were in another world. Uncertain what to do next, Angie and her sister continued to watch the strange pair of lights when, unexpectedly, both objects shot straight up and disappeared into the night sky. The area was purged into darkness, and oddly enough, the normal sounds of the night came back, almost as if it was switched on. As soon as the lights flew away, Deborah said, the car started running again all by itself. The lights, the radio were just on, as if they were before everything happened. According to their watches, the strange encounter has lasted more than 40 minutes. However, when they arrived home, Deborah's husband seemed to be unconcerned about what they thought was a late arrival. That's when they discovered that instead of being after 9 p.m., as their wristwatches indicated, it was only 8:35 p.m. It was as if the entire time we spent looking into those lights had never happened, Angie said, but it did happen. Our watches both showed we had been stuck out there for over 20 minutes, but somehow we gained that time back and a few minutes to spare. Normally we should have been home around 10 to 9, but somehow, despite what had happened, we got there early. Often we hear stories of people encountering UFOs and they have close contact with one and their car will shut off. And then mysteriously will spontaneously start again after the UFO leaves. The disruption of car motors, machinery, and electronic devices during the UFO event have been commonly reported. Thousands of these inexplicable stories have been duly recorded over the years, and many volumes have been written in an attempt to understand the underlying principles involved. Mark Rodger of the Center for UFO Studies analyzed 441 cases in which the car or truck or other motor vehicle in which a witness was either riding or in proximity to was seemingly affected by the presence of a UFO. Headlights, radios, and even flashlights were also affected. Of the vehicle failure cases summarized by Rodriguez, 10% noted an unusual phenomenon called spontaneous engine restarts at the end of a sighting. In reality, this figure is probably much higher, considering the amount of unreported and undocumented cases worldwide. In these cases, the car's engine would mysteriously restart without the driver turning the key. One witness said, "As soon as the UFO flew away, the car radio, headlights, and the car switched back on by themselves. 1 second everything was completely dead, and the next everything was running smoothly, as if nothing had ever happened." The witness said he left with the feeling that his car had been stopped between the ticks of a clock, like time had completely vanished. There's even more evidence that UFOs manipulate time in order to travel. Scientists, brave or foolhardily enough to try and conduct proper research on the nature of UFOs, have been unable to find satisfactory answers as to why the UFO seems to cause time distortions. Past interpretations of Einstein's physics leave little room for localized time anomalies unless influenced by gravitationally massive objects, such as a black hole. However, the new kids on the physics block, quantum and string theory, may show that time and space are easier to influence than were previously thought. Some physicists believe that it's possible to engineer space-time itself and to surround a spaceship with a local space-time in such a way that locally the light barrier remains intact, while from the outside of the ship, moving at faster than light velocity. UFOs that seem to rapidly accelerate, change directions, or even disappear are actually operating conservatively from the viewpoint of their own internal time rates. If someone came close enough to a ship that was creating its own space-time, normal time and space as they know it would cease to exist for them, and they would come under the influence of artificial space-time. This could explain some of the stranger aspects of the UFO encounters, such as environmental sounds disappearing, isolation, the freezing of motors and electronic devices, and the feeling of time slowing down, stretching out, and losing all meaning. The UFO is literally creating an alteration in the local state of space-time, thus generating a major distortion effect that is experienced by the witnesses. Within this time anomaly, the perceived forward motion of time could even disappear, allowing for the past, present, and future to intrude upon one another. I have a story of time distortions, not even related to little people or anything else. A little girl was playing with her dad and she ran off in the tundra here in Alaska, and then all of a sudden everything was weird and quiet. And the next thing she knew, she couldn't find her dad, she couldn't find anyone. It was strange. So she bit herself really hard to try to bring herself back to reality, and then she was able to find her way back somehow. And when she came back, 3 days had passed, but to her only like 15 minutes passed. So UFOs aren't the only thing associated with time distortions, and there's plenty of little people stories where people will have missing time, like they go hang out with the little people for 5 minutes, and when they come back, 15 years have passed. Probably the most famous stories of distortions in time or missing time are with UFO encounters. Here's an interesting story about a man who encountered a strange thin men in black in a library in Pennsylvania. In 1981, Linda Taylor and her mother were traveling by car to Chorlton, a district of Manchester, England. The normally busy road became strangely empty, and the two women noticed a huge light in the sky that seemed to pace their car. Linda told investigators that her car jerked about and slowed down despite her attempts to accelerate. Suddenly, an old-fashioned car appeared in the road up ahead and drove straight towards the two women. At the same time, the light in the sky turned into a metallic disc that hovered over the main road. As the UFO moved away from Taylor and her mother, the old car vanished instantly, When the women returned home, they found that 2 hours were missing from their trip. As with some others who have had close UFO encounters, Linda later had several odd psychic experiences and further time lapses. Time distortions may not always occur with a visible UFO nearby. In 1980, Peter, now a professor of humanities and folklore in New York Juilliard School, was in the University of Pennsylvania library reading a UFO book suggested by another professor. As he read, Peter noticed that someone standing in front of him, looking up. Peter saw a very gaunt, pale man, about 6 feet tall, and weighing around 140 pounds. The strange man wore a black suit, black shoes, black string tie, and a bright white shirt. His suit was loose and looked as though he had slept in it for days. He sat down like he had dropped from the ceiling, all in one movement, and folded his hands on top of a stack of books in front of him, said Peter. The man asked Peter what he was doing. Peter said he was reading about flying saucers. Have you seen a flying saucer? The man asked Peter. He said he didn't. Do you believe in the reality of flying saucers? Peter said he didn't know much about them and wasn't sure he was very interested in the phenomenon. The man screamed, Flying saucers are the most important fact of the century, and you're not interested? The man then stood up again, all in a single awkward movement, put his hands on Peter's shoulder and said, Go well on your purpose. With that, he left. Peter was suddenly overwhelmed by fear. I had a sense that this man was out of the ordinary, and that idea frightened me. I got up and walked around the stacks towards where the reference librarians usually are. The librarians weren't there. There were no guards there. There was nobody else in the library. I was utterly alone and terrified. The professor went back to the table where he had been reading. To get myself together, it took about another hour. Then I got up and everything was back to normal. The people were all there. It would seem that Peter could have been placed in a separate time-space field in order for his contact to occur. The entire episode may have occurred in the blink of an eye in normal time-space, but for Peter, an entire hour passed. One gentleman who reported his alleged UFO abduction on an internet forum said that when he was being returned from an abduction to the motel room where he was staying, he noticed that there was a person in the parking lot below us. Myself and several grays were floating in mid-air, so I had a bird's eye view of the surroundings, who seemed to be frozen mid-step. Everything was dead quiet and nothing was moving. It was as if time had stopped or frozen, and for a few moments it took for them to transport me from the UFO back to my room that was located on the second floor of the motel. These interesting cases show that there is still a lot we have to learn from UFO reports. Investigators need to be willing to look beyond traditional by-the-book questions and allow witnesses to relate their entire experiences, no matter how unusual it may be. Many researchers and databases fail to mention some of the stranger aspects of UFO encounters because they don't fit the peculiar belief system or bias. We can learn much more if researchers put aside their own personal feelings and allow the full information to come forward. Currently, any theories and conclusions are really little more than speculation. Nevertheless, scientists who are not afraid to look beyond the norm are every day developing new concepts in physics and the true nature of reality. Obviously, the way these beings, these aliens or UFO or whatever they are, travel has to do with manipulating gravity and manipulating time. If they were to develop faster than light travel, they may have to create their own field that manipulates gravity and time. And one of the stranger things, like with my own little people encounters, when I heard them talk, it sounded a lot like fast forward speech. Like when I video edit and I run the mouse along the timeline, it goes and when I think back on it, when I heard the weird jabbering or weird talk from like the little people, it sounded kind of similar to that. Like maybe it was going too fast for me to hear. Like their time and our time flows at a different rate. Another notable feature of many cases is sudden and unusual silence an overwhelming feeling of isolation in the proximity of a UFO. Many people have noted that normal sounds, birds, insects, traffic suddenly stopped just before and during a close UFO sighting. A man from Wisconsin reported that he had observed a UFO hovering over the treetops directly over his head once while deer hunting. He stated that the day had been windy and the trees were swaying and creaking pretty loudly in the breeze. What made him look up was the fact that all of a sudden the forest went completely dead. He noted that the trees had stopped moving as if frozen in place. That is when he noticed a strange dark triangle-shaped object floating over the trees. It was a little bigger than a pickup truck and was solid black. I didn't see any lights or hear any kind of sound from it. The hunter reported feeling like he was looking up through a tunnel with me at the bottom and the UFO at the top. I knew that I was completely alone and that no one could help me. As soon as the UFO passed overhead, the forest returned to normal. The experience of such unusual sensations around UFOs have been dubbed the Oz effect by UFO researcher and author Jenny Randles, and many indicate that there could be a field of influence that is being emitted around a UFO. Anyone close enough to a UFO would find himself completely contained within this field. The odd effects noticed by eyewitnesses could give us some kind of indication of the true nature of the energy fields. Unfortunately, anecdotal accounts of UFO experiences have rarely been followed up with rigorous studies of their content. I also have a friend who was in Fairbanks, and she's had a UFO encounter. She was at a state fair, and while she was there, all of a sudden everyone just froze. And when they froze, she was standing and there was a UFO directly above her head, like she was right in the middle. Similar to the story with the triangle and the hunter, she was standing directly in the center of a large UFO and it was moving slowly. And then everyone was frozen except for her, and she was looking around like, what the heck? What the heck's going on here? And then all of a sudden when the UFO moved out of, almost as if there's a cone of energy under it that distorted time, as soon as it moved off of her a little bit, it instantly disappeared and everybody around her started moving normally again. Which makes me think that the mode of transportation and the way they travel has something to do with manipulation of time, and perhaps manipulation of time is directly correlated with manipulation of gravity. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Stay tuned for more. I'm going to keep pumping out more videos.